So, all right, before we go into APIs, though, we got to talk about the interesting life of JSON and XML. So let me go ahead and just make this a little bigger so you guys can see that a little bit better. Sorry, and then your guys' window. Okay, you guys all see that all right? With this amazing, meme that I was just like, oh, you know what? I need to find some JSON, memes. And of course, they're everywhere because, internet. All right, so we're going to talk about JSON, and I'll mention XML. XML is actually in the appendix of the curriculum. We used to talk about JSON and XML together, but in the most part is that you'll see that JSON, everyone loves JSON. JSON's the favorite child. It's also the new kid on the block, and everyone's like, oh, I love JSON, and stuff like that. And XML is just like, XML, get over there. But I will tell you, as a data scientist, like, you will bump into XML. XML is used very frequently still for a lot of businesses, a lot of data formats. JSON just is kind of like, everyone just like JSON because it's the new kid. It's also very useful. I will say is that if I had to choose between XML and JSON, I'm going to go with JSON. But so I'll kind of skip over parts of XML because we'll talk about it again in the future, I think, for like when we talk about HTML and stuff, because it's very similar. All right, so now that we kind of talked about like why JSON is the favorite child, note that JSON, and it's not JSON, right? So kind of note that a little bit. So JSON, right? It's JavaScript object notation. So JavaScript is actually another programming language, just like Python. So basically note that JSON is actually completely valid JavaScript. So if you are familiar with JavaScript, you can actually literally copy and paste all of JSON and treat that as JavaScript code. Okay, so this is what JSON looks like. So what's kind of fun too, so this is kind of fun. I think I mentioned this about this, like you could do like Python and stuff like this. So if I do like Python, it would actually, well, it looks the same, but like basically you can say to your markdown, say, hey, treat this like code as a certain format. So you can see I can treat it as JSON format. So note that basically it looks very similar to like with all these like extra curly braces. There it looks like quotes, right? Like, strings. We have true. Oh, that looks kind of familiar, right? We also have, those square brackets like a dictionary. So JSON and Python actually translate really well to each other. And essentially, if you look more or less, you can almost copy and paste a JSON and it will treat it as legitimate Python. There's a couple exceptions. One main one you'll probably see, it says true. In Python, we use capital true, right, versus lowercase true. In JavaScript, you use lowercase true. So I made this handy dandy little table. Basically, you can see here is that we have our JavaScript example and then our Python equivalent. So in JavaScript, we call these like curly braces objects. So you can see here, basically, there's a key and then a value, and that's the same thing as a dictionary in Python. Arrays, right? So you have these kind of like these square brackets and then values in here. Well, in Python, these are equivalent to list. Okay. Strings, we know what strings are. Note that single quotes in double quotes work both as well. We have numbers, so I just put numbers because Python has a whole bunch of like ways you can talk about numbers. Boolean, note that true and false are lowercase in JavaScript. In Python, it's capital true and false. Okay, and then the biggest probably difference that you'll see like most immediately is null values. A null value is, as you guys probably have heard me say this a few times, is basically an empty value. It means that there's nothing there, which in Python we call this as none. Okay, so that's kind of like more or less how you translate back and forth. Cool. Sound pretty good? Any questions so far? Sound not too bad, right? Nothing too scary if you're used to Python. All right, so let's talk about using Python. So what's kind of cool is that we can actually open up a JSON file. So note that you can just save this stuff directly into a JSON file and load it in and actually create a data frame. So I just wanted to quickly point out, here is a sample JSON file, and this is where I have to think how to open this because I think, okay, it does work. So here is my big old JSON file. Note that basically each of these things are treated like, data, like dictionaries right here. So this is like a whole big dictionary. Every JSON basically starts as, saying, okay, here's my JSON object, right? Or it's my object. And then you have these keys right here, and these keys will point to the next part. In this case, this meta key will point to another object or dictionary in Python speak. And you can see there's only one element in here. So you can kind of like navigate through here. There's a whole bunch of information. A big reason why JSON's really useful and important is very flexible. You can define whatever you want. There doesn't have to be a strict structure and like how you do JSON, as long as you follow the basic, like if you imagine like how you make a dictionary, how you make a list. Basically, as long as those rules are followed, it's completely valid JSON. Okay. So I want to load this into Python, right? So I can actually create this F as my file. So this is open part. Basically, I just open up this file. That's what this F is. And then JSON, which we're importing right here, is a package. And and this will actually load in that file into D, right? And I kind of give you a little hint, right? What kind of type do you think D will be? If I just print out type D.
Dict or
Yeah.
JSON dictionary.
Dict, right? Dictionary, right? So it's type dictionary. And of course, if we print this out, which is going to be a huge, big bunch of stuff, you can see, hey, it looks just like before. And note that when we do the load, it actually changes that, lowercase false into capital false. So it makes it completely valid Python. Okay. Sound pretty good? Everyone following me so far? Awesome, cool. So note that we can actually then take this, like, for example, and check out, for example, for all like the dictionary, we can actually check out the keys. In this case, there are actually only 2 keys. In this case, meta and data, as we kind of saw in that sample JSON right here. There's only really 2 keys. I was trying to make this smaller, but I think it's just formatted in a good way. Just trust me that this goes all the way to the bottom. So depending on what you want to look at, you might want to say, okay, like, let me look at just the meta, let me look at just the data, all that stuff. In this case, you can see here that I will try, let's see, I think this will work. Well, let me see. I want to split this up so I can make sure this works. So note that I can do a data frame from dictionary, right? So it's going to pull in a dictionary because that's what this D meta is. And I'll get a data frame, right? So I actually run this guy. Sorry, I just want to show you guys. Oops. A head. I don't know what a head is. All right, dot head. So you can see here, like, some attributes. If I actually just took out this dot head, you'll see the whole data frame, right? Okay. So you can see here the keys right here are basically treating as essentially indexes, right? And then you can see here this is the column. So note that this is obviously not super clean, right? Because you have to know how to read in and what feature is important. If I do the same thing here, I think I actually get an error. No, I do. Okay. Oh, maybe data is. Oh, I know why. Okay. So you'll notice that data reads a little bit differently. And that's because data actually starts off, it's not going to a dictionary. Oops. I did that. There we go. Data actually isn't going to dictionary. It's actually going to a list, right? Or technically an array. And then this array basically will have different elements. So in an array, basically we treat it like a list, right? Of like, element 1, element 2, element 3, which is why we see essentially each of these rows, element 0, that index, element 1, element 2, and you can see in each of those dictionaries, you might have different things. Note that if you have like, remember JSON can have like dictionaries within dictionaries, or I should say objects within objects. Note that you can get these things, for example, like column number 7 here, you can actually see it looks like a dictionary within a dictionary. So you can kind of see this part is that this is kind of like what we call about dirty data, and you have to kind of like format this in a good way. You have to kind of make sure you know what the structure of the JSON format should be, and then go through that and making sure you process that information correctly. Okay, does that make sense to people? So what I'm trying to get at is basically there is no quick short like, oh, you use this one command and it's just going to import everything into a beautiful pandas data frame, because JSON allows you to have non-tabular data. Basically things that think of it like not in an Excel spreadsheet. Pandas is like an Excel spreadsheet. So it tries its best to do an Excel spreadsheet. This is also, if I do, I'll make a new cell right here. If I do df, is it data? Yeah, .info, you'll see here that you'll have like object. So know that in Pandas, with the version I'm using right now, lower than 1.0, is that object basically is a string. So basically just know that it treats this as if this is a string. However, let's see, row 7, that's clear, just to make it obvious that I'm like, yes, talking about this part. So this is talking about being like a string. Note that in future versions of Pandas, there's an experimental feature in 1.0 right now, but there's actually a distinction between string and object. So object will be treated differently, meaning like an object being like a JSON object, right? Or a dictionary, right? Versus a string where like a string is clearly like, you can see something like, let's say candid, right? That shouldn't be a string versus like an object. So right now, note that the versions lower than 1.0 will always use object, never string. And 1.0, it's optional, it's technically experimental, but you'll probably see this in the next, who knows how many, months, if not years. You'll probably see string as a default and then objects mean something else. Okay, cool. All right, so I'm gonna go on then and say, okay, cool, we can read in data the JSON format. We're gonna output it to JSON, right? So let's say we have something that's already prepared in Python, and now we want to export it to a JSON file because maybe we want to send it over to someone who only reads JSON, right? And we'll talk about that for APIs. So what we can do is like, well, Python, right? We can make a dictionary, right? You can see here, this is actually very similar to the very first one I showed you, an example of JSON, except it's all valid Pythons, right? This is a dictionary. The first key goes to menu. And then in that menu is another dictionary with ID, value, is test, pop up. And then this is pop up actually points to another dictionary and so on. So we're making legitimate Python here, right? And I want to send this now like into JSON format. If you were, if you didn't know this existed, you'd probably say, okay, I need to basically export this over to a string and then change the word true over to lowercase true and look for null values and all this kind of junk. But we can just say, hey, we have packages to do this. So note this with open part. This is basically just saying, hey, open up this file and then open this up as F. That way we don't have to put like F equals open. It's just a kind of a nice shortcut because technically when you open up files in Python, you have to also make sure you close your file, kind of like a folder. But since we don't want to have to deal with that, we can just say, okay, with open as F, it will automatically open up the file and then close it when we're done. Okay, so with this file F, right, we're going to write output.json, right? This is what this W stands for. And then we're going to do json.dump, which is basically Python. And we're going to dump it into this file F, which should be output.json. So just to kind of show you guys, as you can see, there is no output.json, right? And just to kind of refresh to make sure. See, nothing's there. And so when we run this now, we should see it actually create a file. So if I have this here and I go ahead, oh, it's already there. You can see now, hey, there we go. We have our JSON. Okay. So this is really useful when you're basically wanting to send information over to someone who only reads JSON. Okay. Any questions about anything I talked about?
Yeah, sorry. You said we had to close a file as soon as we opened it, right?
Right. It's more like when you're done with a file, you have to close it. Otherwise, basically bad things happen, or can happen, I should say.
And this works here because specifically you used an alias, or because you said with F?
Yeah, I know it's kind of confusing because you're just coming from like a SQL, right? Yeah, this with open right here as F, this is kind of like syntactic sugar. So you can kind of like do things really nice and easy in Python. This is kind of like, you can almost equate this kind of like with like a for loop. You say for, X in list colon, and then you do stuff with the list. You don't have to worry about what happens when you reach the end of that list, right? It's just kind of like, oh, it just ends and you just kind of continue on outward. That's kind of what's going on with this with open. Basically, it's opening up the file and then taking care of that like little extra stuff. Like at the end, that if you did something like F equals open and then the file, if you leave it, if you don't close it, I know it sounds really weird, but like if you don't close the file, there can be memory leakages and stuff like this. And you can get these weird parts where you try to open up the file again. And it's like, oh, it's already open, but like you're writing on top of it. Like, what if you have multiple applications opening it at the same time? The main idea basically is that when you have open up a file, you are writing into something else that something else can also write into. So you don't want to go into that issue where you basically lose your spot where maybe someone's overwriting on top of you. Or when I say someone else, I mean like other applications or other programs. That's my really quick, like hand wavy, like, yeah. Does that make sense, Johnny?
Yeah, for now at least.
Yeah, maybe we can go into more into it. I remember when I first learned Python, it was definitely something where I was just like, it took me a long time to understand files and opening and stuff like that. And for the most part, it's kind of been cleaned up a whole lot, which is really nice. You don't have to memorize all these weird craziness for opening files and closing files. It's more or less kind of like, hey, essentially it's like, hey, just do this and don't worry about it, which is nice. So, yeah, cool. All right. So I'm going to kind of just skip over XML. I'm going to show you XML, but I'm going to skip over it for the most part, okay? So just know XML stands for Extensible Markup Language. Ooh, right, extensible for X, right? So note that basically XML has any, give me a thumbs up if you guys are familiar with HTML. Okay, okay, so some people are, okay. Don't worry about it, it's gonna be in section 10, we're gonna talk about it some more. XML is kind of like, you can think of it like generic HTML. That's kind of what's going on here. And basically just another way to transfer data. I've worked with a lot of XML data and like I'm still working with XML data. If this kind of gives you an idea, like why you should still know how XML works. Note that it's not as nice as JSON because you basically have to, like you can see this JSON.dump, JSON.read, that's really nice and easy. XML doesn't have that same functionality. They're just not as good packages, but mostly because JSON is used so frequently throughout, the web and everything. Okay, but we'll talk about this maybe like next week, maybe during office hours, or maybe even like, next week in section 10. Okay, but I'm gonna skip over it for now just because it's not really relevant to us for right now. I will mention, like I said, like I was like having some fun today to try to find some pictures. I was like JSON and XML, and basically everything's like, oh, XML. I hate XML. Only JSON. So just know that it does tend to be a lot easier to like deal with. Though XML is definitely more older school, where it's been around for a long time. So a lot of applications and a lot of data systems will use XML data. So it's useful to know as a data scientist, right? Okay. So third-party APIs. This is when we can talk about APIs. So I'm going to move on to the next part.